Why waste it on him? My father's tone was laced with disdain, sharp enough to sting even from across the room. He's from a broken home. I froze at the edge of the hallway, gripping the wall as if it could steady the quake inside me. My cousins sat gathered around him, smirking in relief that their children were safe, their futures already secured with the college funds he had built for them. My daughter, my Ava, was the only one cast aside, dismissed as unworthy with a single sentence. My name is Sienna Rhodes. I'm 34. And tell me this, what does it do to a mother when her own father erases her child's worth in front of everyone? It wasn't the first cut. I had swallowed a lifetime of smaller humiliations. Birthday dinners I wasn't invited to, gifts that screamed obligation instead of love, phone calls that never came. But this was different. This was not about me. This was about Ava. That night, I stood quietly in the doorway of her room. She sat cross-legged on the floor, notebooks spread wide like wings, scribbling formulas with the focus of someone building worlds no one else could see. She didn't know that her grandfather had decided she didn't deserve a future. She didn't know that her name had been erased from the family's ledger. My chest burned with a fury I couldn't show her. So when she looked up, her eyes catching mine with unshakable trust, I forced a smile. Calm, gentle, a smile that tasted of blood and resolve. My father always mistook silence for surrender, but mine was a silence that planned. Spring crept in, and with it graduation. The air was thick with lilacs, the stage draped in banners. I sat in the back row, clutching a modest bouquet I'd saved every dollar to buy. My father lounged in the front, chest puffed with a pride that wasn't his to claim. And then Ava spoke. Her voice was steady, her words like fire wrapped in silk. By the time she reached her final line, my father was on his feet, staggered not by pride, but by shock. The reckoning had only begun. The applause thundered through the auditorium, echoing off the walls like a storm that refused to quiet. I watched my father's face as the crowd rose to its feet. His eyes darted from side to side, as if searching for an explanation, a reason why everyone stood for the granddaughter he had dismissed as nothing. Ava stepped down from the podium, her smile bright but humble, the kind of smile that lit people from the inside. She didn't glance at him. She didn't need his approval. She had already eclipsed it. I stayed in my seat, clapping until my palms stung. My bouquet trembled in my lap, petals quivering with every beat of my heart. When the ceremony ended, families swarmed their children with cheers, cameras flashing like fireworks. I moved slowly, letting them pass, letting my father stew in his own silence. He stood stiffly, his pride cracked, his authority suddenly fragile. For once, the man who always had the last word had none. Ava found me at the back. "Mom," she whispered, hugging me tight. "Did you see them stand?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I saw," I murmured into her hair, breathing in the scent of lilacs she had braided there herself. Behind us, I felt his stare, heavy burning. My father's shadow loomed closer. He cleared his throat, but the words caught like stones in his mouth. For the first time, I realized he wasn't just angry. He was afraid. Afraid of a truth he couldn't bury. Afraid of a granddaughter who had spoken louder than his silence. I didn't turn to face him. Instead, I took Ava's hand, lacing my fingers through hers. If he wanted to talk, he'd have to come to us. And I knew he would. Soon. That night, the phone rang just as Ava was washing the last of the dishes. The sound split the quiet kitchen, sharp and insistent. I knew who it was before I even picked up. "Come by tomorrow," my father said flatly. No greeting, no explanation, just command. For years, I had obeyed those clipped orders. But this time, something inside me resisted. Why? I asked, my voice steady. He paused, surprised that I dared to question him. Then he lowered his tone, the way he did when he wanted something. "We need to discuss Ava and the fund." My hand tightened around the receiver. Suddenly the silence stretched long enough that even he could hear the shift in me. "We'll see," I replied and hung up. Ava glanced at me, drying her hands on a towel. "Grandpa." I forced a neutral smile. "Yes." She tilted her head. He didn't sound like himself. No, he didn't. He sounded cornered. The next day, I drove Ava to school beneath skies the color of steel. Rain threatened, but never came, the air thick with pressure. As she stepped out of the car, she turned back, eyes bright. "Don't let him make you small, Mom." Her words settled in me like armor. When I arrived at my father's house, the gate was open, the garden wild from neglect. Inside, the air smelled of dust and coffee gone cold. He sat at the dining table, the same table where he had dismissed Ava's worth. But this time he didn't look triumphant. He looked unsettled. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I didn't move. Instead, I looked at the chair and thought, it almost looks like it's waiting for me to take my place. But not yet. Not on his terms. He shifted in his chair, fingers drumming against the wood, the same rhythm he used to scold me as a child. Only this time his tone was less certain. "You embarrassed me yesterday," he said finally. "That speech. People think I ignored her. They think I play favorites." I let the words hang in the air, heavy and sour. He wasn't concerned about Ava. He was concerned about his image. "You did ignore her," I answered calmly. My voice didn't rise. I spoke it like fact, not accusation. His eyes flicked up, startled by my restraint. "She's from a broken home," he muttered, softer now, as though the words might collapse if spoken too loud. "Broken to you," I corrected, my hands resting lightly on the chair back. "Whole to me." He looked away, his jaw working. On the table sat a small, unopened envelope, his signature college fund packet, the same kind every grandchild had received except Ava. He nudged it forward with 2 fingers. "She proved herself. I'll make it right." I almost laughed, not because of generosity, but because it was too late, too obvious. He was patching cracks in his reputation, not his family. I didn't sit. I let the silence grow, pressing against him until his confidence shrank further. The envelope stayed between us, like a bribe neither of us would name. Finally, I said, "She doesn't need your permission. She doesn't need your money." His mouth opened, then closed again. For once, words failed him. I turned toward the door, my footsteps slow, deliberate. At the threshold, I paused, glancing back at that waiting chair and the envelope beside it. Both sat untouched, symbols of power that no longer bound me. "Next time," I said softly, "remember who stood for her first." And then I left him sitting in his silence. The following week, whispers started trickling through the family. At Sunday dinner, my cousin leaned toward me with a smirk. "Heard your girl made quite a splash at graduation. Grandpa couldn't stop talking about her." I sipped my water, letting the bitterness roll across my tongue. It wasn't pride they'd heard, it was damage control. My father, the man who had dismissed Ava in front of everyone, was now rewriting the story to make himself look like the wise patriarch who had always believed in her. The audacity made my skin crawl. By Wednesday, I began receiving calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. "Your dad said Ava's speech was legendary. He's so proud." Proud? He hadn't even stood willingly. He had been forced to his feet by truth that was undeniable. And now he was stealing her light to polish his own tarnished reputation. That night, Ava walked into the living room holding a letter. Her cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "Mom, it's from the university. They want me to apply for a scholarship. Full ride." I hugged her, my throat tightening with joy. She had carved her own path without his help. But behind the joy burned a new fury. If my father could twist the narrative this easily, he'd erase not only his cruelty, but my daughter's triumph. I couldn't let that happen. I sat awake until dawn, drafting words on paper, scratching them out, rewriting. A letter, yes, but not to him. to the editor of the local paper, the same one that had covered the graduation ceremony. If my father wanted to play legacy, then the truth would live in ink, not his mouth, and the world would read exactly who had stood in Ava's way before they stood beside her. The article printed 2 days later. Front page of the community section. Student speech leaves audience in awe, a lesson in resilience. They quoted Ava's closing line word for word. They described the silence before the applause, the way the crowd rose to its feet, the way even the most stoic faces cracked open with tears. Nowhere was my father's name. Nowhere was his false pride. The truth was sealed in print beyond his reach. By evening, my phone buzzed nonstop. Neighbors, teachers, even strangers congratulated Ava. She floated through the house, glowing, unaware of the quiet war I was waging in the background. Then came his call. My father's voice was tight, brittle. You think you're clever? Undermining me in public. I let the silence stretch, then answered evenly. I didn't undermine you. I just told the truth you tried to bury. His breath hissed over the line, followed by a low growl. Family doesn't air its business for outsiders. Then maybe family shouldn't treat its own like outsiders, I said, my voice low but steady. He hung up. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the sting of his rejection. I felt free. Later that night, I found Ava asleep on the couch, the newspaper folded across her chest like a badge of honor. Her face was peaceful, untouched by the shadows that haunted me. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered, "They'll never erase you again." But deep inside, I knew my father wasn't done. Men like him never surrendered. They shifted, plotted, sought new ways to control the narrative. And if he came again, I would be ready. Because silence was no longer my weapon. Truth was. Sunday arrived, heavy with the scent of rain. Family dinner, once a ritual I endured in silence, now felt like a stage I was prepared to step onto. Ava clutched my hand as we walked into my father's house, her scholarship letter folded neatly in her purse like a shield. The dining room buzzed with chatter, silverware clinking against china. My father sat at the head of the table, posture stiff, face carefully composed. But his eyes, those betrayed him. Cold, restless, searching. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, his voice pitched high with forced authority. "I've always believed in encouraging our young ones. Ava's performance at graduation was exactly the kind of excellence I've fostered in this family." Murmurs of approval spread around the table. A few cousins nodded, swallowing the lie without question. Ava's fingers tightened around mine. She looked at me, confusion flashing in her eyes. I rose before my father could continue, my chair scraping the floor. The room fell silent. "With respect," I began, my voice calm but steady, "that's not true. Ava's achievements are her own. She was ignored, dismissed, and cast aside. And yet she rose. Not because of this table, but in spite of it." Gasps rippled. My father's face drained of color. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded newspaper. Setting it on the table, I tapped the headline with my finger. "The truth doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to her." Ava's chin lifted, her eyes bright with something fierce, recognition, pride, freedom. My father's hand trembled as he tried to steady his glass. For once, no words came. And in that silence, everyone at the table finally saw him for what he was. The silence at that table stretched long enough to swallow the ticking clock on the wall. My father sat frozen, the glass trembling in his hand, while the rest of the family shifted uneasily in their seats. For decades, his word had been gospel, his authority unquestioned. But in that moment, the weight of truth, printed in black and white, lay heavier than his legacy. I remained standing, my breath slow, measured. This isn't about money. It isn't about appearances. It's about dignity. My daughter deserved to be seen, and you chose blindness. No one spoke. Even the clink of cutlery had stopped. Ava sat straighter, her young shoulders carrying a strength that outshone every inheritance at that table. She unfolded the letter from her purse, the paper crisp, edges glowing faintly under the chandelier's light. "I've been offered a full scholarship," she said, her voice steady, ringing with quiet triumph. "I don't need anyone's fund. I built my own future." Gasps broke the silence, but they weren't directed at her, they were aimed at him. My father's mask cracked. For the first time he looked small, his empire of control collapsing under the simple truth of her achievement. One by one, relatives shifted their gaze from him to Ava. Pride flickered in their eyes, not pride that belonged to him, but to her and to the resilience that had carried her here. The throne he'd built at the head of the table suddenly looked less like power, more like an empty seat no one respected anymore. I gently placed a hand on Ava's shoulder, grounding her in that moment. "You see," I said softly, my eyes fixed on him, "what you tried to erase only grew brighter. You taught me silence, but she taught me voice. And now the story is hers to tell, not yours." He lowered his gaze, defeated not by anger, but by truth too loud to bury. We stood together, mother and daughter, and walked away from the table, our steps unhurried, our dignity intact. Behind us, the chatter didn't return. Only the sound of his breath, shallow and hollow, remained in the room. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Ava wasn't just my daughter. She was proof that love, not legacy, writes the final word.